Hi, this is Greg Salmieri for the Objectivism Program at the Salem Center here at the University of Texas, Austin. Joining me, as usual, is Ben Bayer, and this is another edition of our Choose Your Issues podcast. Today we're just going to chat about some recent developments in the culture wars, or as I think of them, the culture as education and education wars. We don't have so much of an agenda, it's just a bunch of topics we want to start out with, and I'll jump over to you, Ben, to pick one out of the hat and start us off on it.
Well, the one that I think makes most sense to start with is one that you've just told me about, but it sounds pretty interesting nonetheless. And this is a tweet that came from Ibram X. Kendi on the occasion of President's Day, which we just had yesterday. And I celebrated by going for a hike in the hill country, but Ibram X. Kendi celebrated by doing something rather different. He tweeted,
Here
we go. On President's Day, it's important to recall that at least 12 U.S. presidents enslaved black people, 8 while in office. 2/3 of the first 18 presidents collectively enslaved nearly 2,000 black people. We know what largely built this nation, and it wasn't freedom. So the first two sentences of his tweet seem unimpeachable from a factual perspective. What was it you wanted to say about it?
I think they matter, but the last one, I think, what built this country? I mean, if you had, someone built a house who had a heroin habit, you wouldn't say, we know what built this house, and it was heroin, right? If it was, the house wouldn't stand well. What is it that slavery built the nation? Where does that come from? And what does that mean? That makes slavery seem awfully efficacious, doesn't it? But it's not. Slavery is a tyrannical, oppressive, and extremely ineffective way of accomplishing anything other than creating human misery. The idea that the country was built built on slavery rather than with slavery, or despite slavery, I think is something that they really need to be distinguished. There was slavery at the founding. There was slavery through a lot of the country's history. There was a lot of other kinds of injustice. There's a big difference between acknowledging that and acknowledging that that's important on the one hand, and thinking that that's the main causal factor that built the country, meaning made the country able to be successful, made it able to be a world power, made it able to be rich and prosperous. And all of those things it just did not do. It's not the kind of thing that could do. There was a really nice thread responding to Kendi by an acquaintance of mine, Camille Foster, from Big Think. And he talked about some of the obvious factual problems with attributing America's prominence in the world to its having slavery. Mostly that most of the other countries in the New World had slaves, indeed more slaves than America did, and yet none of them have had the kind of prosperity or role in world history that America has had, that is, that the United States of America has had. But so there's a kind of just historical dubiousness of the claim. But there's a kind of deeper dubiousness of it. It's claiming that evil is effective and evil works, that slavery was a real boon for the country. And I think so long as people go on thinking that, they're in effect functioning as apologists for slavery. As horrible as they might think it is because they don't think efficiency or efficacy matters, it amounts to a kind of whitewashing or apology for slavery. Slavery was barbaric and it impoverished the country. I don't mean to say it doesn't have effects on where money went and what industries prospered as opposed to what others at what times. Of course it did, and those things one needs to think about in assessing the details of the history of the country. But at the macroscopic level, this was a burden on us. It was a bad thing for everybody. Worse, of course, for the people who were enslaved than for everybody else. Worse by orders of magnitude, but not something that benefited the rest of the country. Barbarity is barbarousness is barbaric, and it doesn't help anybody. It's not why the country's rich. It's not why the country's prosperous.
So what would you say then to somebody who takes maybe a little bit of issue with your opening analogy about the house with the heroin dealer. Of course, the heroin didn't build the house. Heroin's a drug that you take. But slaves actually build things. They do manual labor. And arguably, there are a great number of structures related to our nation's founding, which they actually played a part in physically constructing. So
But that's not what built on means.
Okay.
Built on means what's the foundation, what's the driving force for the creation of the thing. The country was built with all sorts of injustice, with injustice of all kinds factoring into it, and slavery was the worst one of those. But that doesn't mean that what it was built on. That doesn't mean that that's the foundation of it, that that's the cause of the successes that there's been, that that's the cause of the prosperity, or that that's the essential fact about the history of the nation, of any nation, but particularly about the history of what distinguishes this nation from others. The analogy to the heroin is it's if somebody creates something and that person's a drug addict, you don't say that the drug is what enabled them to create the thing. You say they were able to create this thing despite this addiction, and you'll expect the addiction to have effects on it. Maybe parts of it were done in a more slapdash manner because they were in withdrawal or whatever. It's going to have some role to play in the history, and it's something that you should be aware of when thinking about it. But it's not the principle that caused the thing to stand that they built.
I think to make this point of yours really plausible and persuasive, though, you need to probably actually go into some economics, because from the very conventional views of economics that people have these days, it would sound plausible. Okay, these slaves built this property had value, the slave owners extracted the surplus value from the slaves by doing it. That's kind of standard Marxist economics. But even Keynesian views.
But Marxists thought that slavery was inefficient, right? And
well, you could wonder about what his basis for and whether it was consistent with his theory. But my point is to really make the point that it was economically destructive. You'd have to point to things like imagine what the, in effect, opportunity cost was for the slaves, and what they could have been doing with their time and with their minds, and what that would have added to the productive base of the country if it weren't for the fact of slavery.
Yeah.
I mean, think about someone like Frederick Douglass and how many others there might have been like him.
But you don't even need...
you don't need just the geniuses to make that point.
In the case of a genius who was able to rise out of the worst condition, just any person who is able to function as a human being and apply his mind to the task of figuring out how to do a good job of something that he wants to do that brings value into the world that other people could appreciate, and he trades with them for that, versus he's under a lash, reduced to the most grinding misery and eking out the tiniest sustenance. And some fool thinks that that's efficient because it can get a little bit more cotton than some other way of doing it, without a thought given to, well, why cotton? What about all the other things that could be being grown if people were allowed to think about what to do? Why is it the fact that this one resource was slightly cheaper than some others because somebody found the most brutal way to eke out the little bit of efficiency of it? Not a tremendous waste of millions of people's lives and of all the things that those people could have done with those lives that would have benefited themselves and other people. And we can see how wasteful and awful it was by the fact that places with slavery are always poorer than places that are otherwise similar without it. And we can see this in the history of the New World. We could see it in why the North prospered compared to the South, why the states that had slavery are still poor and backwards compared to the ones that got rid of it earlier. And this is well known and well documented, and it's just a kind of evasion and apologizing for slavery, I think, on a cultural level that is keeping this going. It's making the slaver's mistake to imagine that this is somehow some sort of source of great wealth. I mean, it's a source of wealth to some people rather than others. It's a source of how wealth got shifted around. And we could talk about the particular injustices and what can be done to, or has been done to remedy them. There are all kinds of questions about reckoning with the past of slavery. But thinking that one could ask, and I think ought to be asked, but thinking that slavery is what built the country, is what made the country prosperous and rich, that is conceding so much to the slaving mindset that it's I think despicable that people who pass as crusaders against racism and anti-racist thinkers engage so regularly in that kind of thinking today. And I think Kendi is a real example of that.
There's a story that's often told about Julian Simon, who's the economist who was famous for
The bet.
with Paul Ehrlich about whether or not our resources would run out. Simon famously argued that population growth is not the bomb that Ehrlich thought it would be, that it could potentially be a boon to human prosperity, because the more human beings you have on Earth, the more minds there are who are available to solve the problems of survival. And the story about Simon is not so much that I was going to point to, wasn't the bet, but the part of his inspiration for coming up with his hypothesis was a visit to, I think it was Arlington National Cemetery, looking at the thousands and thousands of graves of dead American soldiers who died. I think in particular World War II was what he was thinking about, and thinking about what if they had lived to think and produce and trade and offer value to other people during the 20th century. And you can think the same thing, not just about the American war dead, but the German war dead, and the other millions of people around the world who died during World War II. And you can make the same exact point about slavery, not only because they often were killed, such as in the Middle Passage in the Atlantic, but
Because they weren't allowed to live while they were
killed
alive.
as human beings while they were alive. That was indeed one of the major points that Douglas argued in his critique of slavery, that it takes a human being and treats it like an animal who has to work under a whip, and shackles and destroys the human mind.
So we're trying to make this more conversational. And Jen, you want to join us?
Yeah. So I didn't receive the greatest education on American history. I went to public school and it wasn't that great. But the narrative that I took away was that, before America became independent, agriculturally, it was like this great abundance and boon of them exporting agricultural goods and other things to Britain, and that it significantly was like a game changer. So
what is the slavery, the exports?
The exports and the agricultural goods specifically. Like it was this, I was raised that it was this cornucopia of like goods that had never been seen before. And it was like clearly an upward trajectory, a boon basically, or, before, like with the slavery. And so I think that that's something that you would need to address, but in connection with my next thought, which is I'm a little skeptical about this analogy with the heroin addict who builds a house, basically because of what Ben was saying earlier about how like there is a non-optimal but like causal connection where the slavery, while unoptimal, was having a positive effect on that agricultural production. But I can't see heroin in any way operating as some kind of positive helper at all. It could like only be a negative. But it seems you're trying to make a point, which is you're not arguing that the slavery didn't have some kind of positive effect on America's ability to produce all of these things and export them. But sort of this kind of Bastiat-esque the seen versus the unseen argument, which I think is a really good one, though in my experience, people aren't always so quick to be convinced of it because they think that you're asking them to take you on faith. That, trust me, the fact that there was this huge population of human beings in the country whose creative faculties and mental ability was being untapped and shut down. And like that's, without coming off as commodifying these people, but like that's capital that was unlocked.
Well, the way I think of the analogy with the heroin, it's how the thing was done. The house was built by someone who was high versus the house being built by someone when they weren't high, when they were in their right senses. The house was built by someone struggling under this addiction and under this damaging thing. And the question is, what would production have looked like in America if it were not done by enslaved people? It was not done under a system of slavery. If it were done freely, voluntarily. So I see it as similar. There are people building things, and how are they doing it? With whips and lashes and forcing one another to do things, some of them forcing others, or through voluntary exchange. Likewise, someone's building a house. How are they doing it? Whacked out of their mind or soberly? And you might think, well, the force helps them do it. But the addict probably thinks that too. If I can only get through the day if I get another bump or so forth, otherwise I'm going to be, whatever, in withdrawal. If there's work to be done and there's value to be had in getting people to do the work, right? How do you go about doing it? Do you try to pay people, induce people to come from different places with money, try to make deals that are attractive to both of them? Or do you spend your time forcing them, capturing people, dragging them in ways that kill half of them on the way there, and then forcing them to work in the most immiserating conditions? Those are two different ways to do it, right? And it might have an effect on what things you do. Maybe you would grow tobacco instead of cotton or something, or you'd ranch instead of whatever, depending on which you did. But we know that the one of them is a tremendously ineffective way to do things, and it's ineffective because it's evil. But I think that tie between evil and just the horrible waste that it is of life, but of everything. There's not an upside to evil. And it's too often spoken as if there is. And as for the boon in early America, I mean, there was...
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the part that you learned about the benefits of newly international trade after the age of exploration on some level is indisputable. And it's for the reason that that any economist would acknowledge, which is Adam Smith's point about comparative advantage. The North America was much better at producing tobacco than any other part of the world. But that same point about why international trade is beneficial it's the same reason why slavery is bad. Because slavery deprives individuals of their comparative advantage by, instead of saying, we're going to see which career you choose, how you choose to trade freely with other individuals, we're going to instead impose a centrally planned profession on you, and regardless of what your talents or skills or interests happen to be.
I mean, when we say that's why it's bad, I think we have to be...
That's why it's ineffective.
Careful not to minimize it. It's bad because it destroys people's lives. And that is inefficient and ineffective and bad for everybody, because people living well is good for one another. Everything that's valuable that we get from other people, we get from them living as human beings, creating, thinking, and destroying them, therefore is bad for everybody. But there's a lot to say about kind of the economy of early America and of the New World generally. There's this whole field of new economic history that tries to stress the importance of slavery. And slavery was very important to the specifics of how the economy played out, which industries at which times were focused on. But if you look at the kind of overall ways that nations progress and that economies progress, places that their primary value in the world economy is that some raw material is coming from them, end up as poor and benighted places unless their economy switches over from that. And they only do switch over from that under conditions of relative freedom. And what we saw in America is you would have thought that either, if you were looking at it from this kind of resource lens, you would have thought that either New England would be the place because of the timber coming from it that was economically valuable, or the South because of the cotton. But it turned out being lower New England and New York because of manufacturing in them. And then progressively the Midwest, as manufacturing moved, that were the real dynamisms, the real dynamos of the country's growth. And yes, it is true that all the manufacturing involved, a lot of it involved textiles, and the textiles involved material from the South. But there was material coming from all over, and there were all kinds of places where it could have been, where the industry could have developed. There were reasons why it developed where it did. It can't develop under conditions of slavery, and it didn't, either here or elsewhere.
So maybe one last point on this Candy post that will transition us into the next issue is, so you've been commenting mostly on his point about whether or not this nation was built on slavery, but there's also, I think, a point to make about the presidents, which is the occasion for his post. And it's true that all of these presidents that he mentions owned slaves, and that added up to a lot of enslaved people and a lot of injustice. But it would also be missing out on some important aspects of history if we just left it at that and didn't say anything more about the character of some of these presidents. One person we can comment on is Jefferson, who, of course, authored the Declaration of Independence and was himself highly ambivalent about slavery. There were drafts of the Declaration of Independence where he wanted to say more vocally against it and was persuaded not to. He, of course, held his slaves until the end of his day, but it was his ideas that were championed by abolitionists and subsequently by the civil rights movement. So you've got to give him some credit for that. I would also give credit to Washington, who I think I was just reading about him the other day in this regard. He was much more, I think, disturbed by slavery over the course of his life, and took active efforts to free his slaves upon his death and provide for them in his absence, and was of the shared privately with people that he was opposed to the institution and thought that it should end. And you can argue about whether he should have done more. Probably should have if he had known how to in that day and age. And it's certainly his omissions and Jefferson's omissions were ones that many subsequent presidents and Americans would have to pay for dearly when we came to the time of the Civil War and the death of millions of Americans. That was a price paid to finally end that peculiar institution.
Well, it's more than their omissions, right? These were people who were actively holding slaves, or actively enslaving people, as we say now. I don't love that term because it sounds like you're taking them into slavery in the first place, but it captures something, which is that it's not a kind of person a slave. There's a person being held in bondage, and these are people holding people in bondage, holding the whips. And I don't think it's mere omission. There's commission there, right?
Fair enough.
But it's a kind of commission of a horror that was horrifyingly common here and elsewhere during that time, and in various forms throughout human history. What is distinctive about these people is that they grasped and fought for principles that would lead to the abolition of that and other horrors. And to different extents, they grasped the significance of that and struggled with it in their own lives.
Some of them.
Well, to different extents. And Jefferson really did. And I think Washington did. And I don't think it's ambivalent. I think Jefferson's view was that slavery is wrong. How that fit with his continuing.
He was ambivalent about what his own decisions would be with.
But I think it's easy once an institution is abolished to say what you think people who are in the midst of it and who recognize that it was evil should do. But it's, I think, harder than people imagine. If you're in a country that's economy involves a lot of slavery, even if you get rid of your slaves or free them all, the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the fibers in them, so much of it is still going to be based on slave labor. You could say, well, that everybody's complicit in it, and sometimes you might think that's true, but the question is, what do you do to change it? You either just leave the country altogether, well, then that's not going to change it, or maybe it will by depriving it of all those mines. Or but it's a hard problem to figure out how to get out of, how to disentangle, how to fix the country when there's a kind of massive injustice of that scale there. And while you're doing that, or to the extent that you can't do it, how to live your life. And I think all of these people made real mistakes about that, but it's easy to be puffed up about, oh, I know what the right answer, what they should have done is. If you really start thinking about what they should have done and playing it out, a lot of the options that seem obviously right, I think, turn out not to be. That's not to say, in Jefferson in particular, I can think of a lot of things he did wrong, but it's not obvious what the right course would have been. Even if you think of Jefferson in a relationship sexually with one of his slaves, or as we might put it today, raping her, the whole idea of consent in marital relations at a time when women either weren't recognized fully as individuals is difficult to get one's head around.
Well, let's transition to another topic, which I think has some interconnections with this one, both because it relates to a recent holiday and tweets made on the occasion of that holiday, but more superficial.
Valentine's tweet.
You tweeted on Valentine's Day about Margaret Sanger, but I think that the overlap is not only superficial, because there's a thematic connection here about how we think about historical figures, their achievements and in relation to their sins, and how our contemporary culture processes those things. And so maybe you should just start by reiterating the point that you made, and then we can talk about the controversies that arose.
I just tweeted out on Valentine's Day a tweet of appreciation for someone who I think should be regarded as more as a hero than she is now, which is Margaret Sanger, who was a crusader for birth control. And I think people just aren't aware of how much she did in this field and how much there was to be done by her and others. So when she began her work, birth control, like any kind of birth control, condoms, diaphragms, etc., were illegal in much of the country, couldn't be sent through the mail. Only kind of people who were in the know and maybe wealthier had the knowledge of how to prevent unwanted
They couldn't even be sent through the mail. That was still in violation of the Comstock Act.
Exactly.
She helped.
And her husband was the one of the parties to the original suit to that case. And just knowledge of birth control was of any kind was so scarce and illegal to be promulgated. And she's the person who set up an organization, the Birth Control League, to kind of promote that knowledge, set up centers and so forth, giving people control over their own sexuality. And not only did she do that, but she spearheaded, financed, and was in many ways involved with the creation of the contraceptive pill, the birth control pill, which was the first chemical form of birth control. And and did it through basically fundraising and hiring researchers and as basically a kind of venture capital, or not really venture, but whatever, for the birth control pill. And the difference that effective birth control and just knowledge of birth control makes in someone's life is tremendous. And it's if you are in a romantic relationship, if you're having sex at a time when you don't want children, whether you want children later or you have some children but you don't want more right now or whatever, if you're having sex when you don't want to get pregnant or you don't want your partner to get pregnant, you owe a debt of gratitude to the people who made that possible. And she, I think, is first and foremost among them. And yet people don't think about that at all. They take totally for granted the control they have over their own sexuality. And when when I talked about this, people talked about, problems with the pill and side effects and so forth, or all about abortion, which Sanger wasn't even in favor of, although the organization she created became Planned Parenthood and so forth, which I think is great. I'm very much in favor of abortion. But that's sort of almost beside the point. And I think Valentine's Day, a holiday celebrating love, is a time when we should think about what made it possible for us to engage in acts of love responsibly.
Okay, but all that being said, the thing that Sanger's so controversial for, and which came up in the thread in response to your post, was that there were ways in which she was in support of the eugenics movement that was popular among intellectuals in the early 20th century, and some would argue popular for racist reasons. And there's allegations.
Eugenics is racist in its nature.
Well, say more about that, and say more about how you would respond to that allegation. Well, this is why we shouldn't celebrate her, because it sounds pretty awful.
Eugenics understood as the idea that we want to shape racially the next population, or shape biologically the next population, that's the kind of, we're determining how things are going to be based on their genes at the population level, collectivistically, I just think that is racism.
Well, but just to be clear here, if your view is, let's say, that we should eliminate people who are feeble-minded from the population, which is the language that the eugenicists use, you could think that there are feeble-minded people regardless of their color of skin, and that you could be an equal opportunity eugenicizer.
Yeah, but I think
it's not necessarily
was
racism.
Much broader than, as a movement, we're going to find, we're going to eliminate some diseases or something like that. It was much more the idea that there are higher and lower stocks of people, better and worse stocks of people. We want to be encouraging the better stocks to breed and the worse stocks not. I think that
when
was
you take it in
essential
historical
to
context, the people who were in fact behind it, even if you could conceptually separate that, were...
Well, I think that's what eugenics is. I don't think the idea that... I just think that's what the concept's always meant.
Okay, but then doesn't this make her involvement relationship with this movement even more problematic? If in fact the eugenics of the period were, essentially racist by their motivation and nature.
It was a bad movement, and she shouldn't have been involved with it, and nobody should have been involved with it. But most people who are intellectuals of any stripe, or at least a huge number of them, had some involvement with this movement. I don't think hers was especially pronounced, but it's not something distinctive and important about her by comparison to her accomplishments. The best analogy to it would be Ford and anti-Semitism. Henry Ford was an anti-Semite, and a really influential anti-Semite. He had a lot of money behind him due to his motor company, and he was able to publish a newspaper that republished the Protocols of Zion and all these horrible things. But that's not the main thing about Ford as a historical figure. It's an important footnote to him. It's diminishing of him. But if all somebody knows about or thinks about Ford, it doesn't have anything to do with the Model T or cars, but that he didn't like Jews and did some really awful things about them, that is a real mistake.
Okay, but here I have to come to Margaret Sanger's defense, because I think she was much better than Ford.
She was.
In this regard.
But that's...
And it's worth putting some of this on the record. So she was definitely in favor of eugenics. But when I said previously one could be a eugenicist who was an equal opportunity eugenicizer, the evidence in her case seems to be exactly that was her position. And she was allied with W.E.B. Du Bois on subjects of racial equity and justice, and was engaged in an outreach project to help poor black women in Harlem get access to birth control. Now that's
and
part
in the
of
South as well.
Yes, now that's part of the reason why some people form conspiracy theories saying that she just wanted to encourage birth control with black Americans because she wanted to exterminate the race. But there's no evidence for that, except the kind that's manufactured. There's one quote that's often taken out of context, and where it says we don't want people to think that what we want to do is exterminate the race. And in fact, the reason that she's saying that is precisely because she's worried people might think it falsely, and she's giving the talk to, I think, a group of black ministers who are interested.
It was a letter, I think, but yeah.
It might have been a letter, who are interested in joining her cause because they see that they agree with her that black women, like white women, deserve the right to control their body and their future and enjoy sexual pleasure without having to have the burden of an unwanted child. And so it's just there's so many urban legends about this.
It's true. The particular things that are said about her are that tie her to eugenics are often taken way out of context. and distorted. But I still think the Ford analogy, there were things she did. For example, she spoke to a KKK assembly.
Women's
I think
Auxiliary of the KKK,
and I
which she
think
later
what-
regretted because
yeah.
she thought they were half-wits.
And I think what she probably said to them is, you guys should be using birth control.
Gotcha.
And she seems to have said that to pretty much every audience she addressed. Birth control is great. We should have more birth control, etc. But she was, I think, too promiscuous in how she would say that message. And she did things like say, it's good for the health of the race, it's good for this, it's good for that, in ways that made it seem subordinate to eugenics, even though I think it's clear if you look at the scope of her work that her kind of basic principle was empowering people to make decisions individually over their own reproduction. She was a kind of socialist anarchist politically, insofar as she had political views. They seem to have shifted around during her life. But that kind of, person who imagines that anarchy and socialism can exist and that it will be empowering to individuals. Someone like Noam Chomsky probably would be someone like that today. And it's, I think, a bad political view. But it's, which I think another problem with her, but she kind of allied, in effect, I think she's somebody who really recognized the value of birth control, but was willing to sing its praises in any key, subordinated to any ultimate value she thought any audience had. And I think that is a mistake that tarnishes her legacy. But what's the essence of her legacy? The essence of her legacy is creating this tremendous value that almost everybody benefits from. And yet she's not talked about in light of that. Even Planned Parenthood kind of distances themselves from her these days, in the same way that everyone does from heroes of the past when they find their foibles.
And that's the interesting connection. Well, it's one of the interesting connections back to the controversy about the presidents, because isn't it interesting how conservative critics of contemporary quote-unquote cancel culture will say, how dare you attack the presidents when there are so many good things they did just because of this sin that they committed, and then turn 180 degrees and they do the exact same thing when they're dealing with a figure who they really don't like for other reasons, not because they have this keen sense of history and the person's place in it.
Well, I think a lot of the antipathy towards her has to do with, among conservatives, has to do with an antipathy towards sex and sexual liberation.
Well,
and there's a kind of taking over of quote anti-racist or wokey kind of tropes to make her a kind of subject of attack.
but then that's also interesting, because you hear today in debates about abortion and abortion rights and what the impact of the overturn of Roe v. Wade is going to be, that, oh, no, we're not opposed to contraception. We just don't want killing babies. But you scratch them enough, and underneath that opposition to abortion, you do start to see this antipathy to contraception coming out.
And more you're hearing ambivalence about the historical role of birth control, and there's more and more a kind of tradcon voice that used to be never spoken aloud that you're hearing kind of around the periphery of the right these days.
The other, so one interesting lesson then from this is that if you're going to come to the defense of the American founders or of any of the greats of Western civilization on the ground of they had an essential achievement in spite of their mistakes and imperfections, you should do that consistently, not just with the figures who your political tribe tends to associate with. But then another interesting lesson, perhaps, especially from the case of Sanger, is it really does matter what kind of company you keep and what kind of audiences you speak to and what kind of principles you use in deciding which kinds of audiences you speak to. And it's not just any old audience who's eager to hear your position on some concrete issue that's worth speaking to. And I mean, this is as you imagine, this is an issue that there's been a lot of debate about in circles related to Ayn Rand and her philosophy and its relationship to libertarianism. Some libertarians are anarchists,
and so forth. Yeah.
and the Ayn Rand Institute has taken a lot of stands against speaking to certain kinds of anarchist libertarian audiences, for instance, for this kind of reason, and faced a lot of pushback against it. Well, I mean, it matters. It matters, and history will judge you too about the kinds of associations you keep. And the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire was also posting things about how much it hated all the presidents and celebrating their assassinations.
Oh yeah, that was horrifying.
So, gee, maybe it wasn't good to associate with them in the first place.
Yeah, there was a post that's we don't like any of these presidents, but at least
we do like the way they died.
That was really disgusting and wicked. It reminds me of a Ayn Rand anecdote. She had been particularly virulent critic of John F. Kennedy's administration, and thought he was particularly awful. And somebody asked her then shortly after his assassination in the Q&A, "Aren't you pleased by what happened?" And she was indignant and said, "This is America. This isn't how we do away with politicians. We vote." And sort of told the person off. At least so it's reported. There's no recording. But it's just yeah. So these principles about who you associate with and how are things by which history should judge us, but it should judge us objectively. And I think a big part of judging people objectively, particularly historical figures, is having a value focus. And I don't think people do. I think if you start thinking about what things make a big positive difference in your life, what things you're relying on that make things possible for you to be happy, possible for you to chart the kind of life that you want for yourself in ways that wouldn't have been possible to earlier generations of people, and just think about it concretely, about particular things, and then think about who's responsible for those things, who made them. How were they made? Everything that's of value to us had to be created by someone, and who created it. And it gives you a very different perspective on the world. And two things made me very defensive of Sanger. One was doing that exercise. In particular, when my wife and I were getting married, we decided to make something I called approbation cards. They were little place-setting cards with different people on them. And I decided I'm just going to focus on positive things we like, big and small, but that it meant something to our lives and who created them. And if the people had flaws, I didn't like, for example, we liked Ben and Jerry's ice cream, but we didn't like their politics. We did a card for them. It's just, did the people do are they responsible for something that we liked? And that was a very small scale one, the ice cream. Birth control is a big deal. And when you start seeing like, wow, the same person who like was involved in the Comstock laws also financed the pill, and this, it's just, this is a major boon to people. And then the other thing, a little bit before one of my grandmothers died, she was Jewish, and in the population that a lot of the eugenicists would have liked to see done away with. I was talking to her about kind of like her history and her life, and I forget even how the concept came up, but she mentioned, oh yeah, when I was going to get married, I went to the Sanger Clinic in Manhattan and I learned how to use it. I was like, wow, this is, my grandmother had 3 children, not more than 3, right? And she wanted 3, and people, have just a lot more control over their life now because of what this woman did. And people I know, and all of us, in fact, everybody I know. But, at a certain time, it was more connected to her name.
Those of us who want no children at all, such as my wife and I, very grateful. Okay. Let's maybe turn to another controversial figure in the news, who's also been probably lighting up social media, not just recently, but for months and months. And there's a similar effort to disabuse the world of her value because, in this case, not because of some real flaw, I would argue, but because of an invented one. And this is J.K. Rowling. And there was a very, I think, excellent piece in the New York Times this past weekend in defense of J.K. Rowling by Pamela Paul, who is a regular contributor to the New York Times, basically challenging at the root the accusation that J.K. Rowling is a transphobe, quote unquote, and that she deserves to be censured for that, and doesn't deserve the accolades that she continues to garner from her many fans.
The piece in the Times was, I assume, occasioned by the
podcast.
The podcast that Barry Weiss's outfit, what's it called now, the Free Press, is doing on her. That and the woman behind the podcast is I'm forgetting her name, but she was grew up in Westboro Baptist and is now a journalist.
I don't remember myself. I'll look it up, but. So what should we say?
Anyway, so there are these two. There's a kind of campaign now to defend J.K. Rowling and to say that there's been she's been treated unjustly, which I think she has, and treated as a transphobe or anti-trans or some kind of threat to the trans community. There's a lot one could argue here about just exactly what does she say or think about trans people, and is she right or wrong about it? And I'm not sure. And then what's the right position to have on various issues that are touted as in the interest of trans people? And I'm not sure even that you and I agree on all of those things. You had a more positive view of Stock's book, for example, than I did, although you read the whole thing and I've only read bits of it.
That's relevant.
But from what you described of it, I have a less positive view than you do of what she held. But as I see it, the key issue here isn't whether Rowling is right or wrong in what she thinks on various issues about single space places for women and about exactly about trans identification and each of the tweets she made, and with this one in good or bad taste and with that one mocking. But this idea that we can suppose she's wrong about a fair number of these things.
Even if she is, it doesn't make her a quote unquote transphobe.
Right. Or because we could wonder what that term means or whatever.
Yeah.
An anti-trans or a hater of trans people, or someone who's what they're doing in this world is making life dangerous for trans people, or more dangerous for trans people than it would otherwise be. Someone can be wrong about things. Again, put aside the question of whether she is. And every time someone's wrong about things, the wrong ideas are dangerous and can lead to harm. That's in the nature of falsehood, that if people believe it and act on it, it makes things worse. But there's got to be some kind of sense of proportionality and perspective. And if you're in a situation where there's been a cultural sea change concerning a confusing and difficult issue very recently, and your view is that anybody who's a prominent holder of all but the most up-to-date
trendy
versions
views
of the views that are popular in a certain subculture about what's best for any group of people, and about how we should prioritize a group of people. If not being right by your lights about those things constitutes being a hater, a transphobe, transgressive, etc., that is a really blinkered and dangerous way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that is far more dangerous to whatever people you imagine yourself to be protecting than anything the haters could be doing. I mean, no.
I mean, the piece that we were talking about from the Times opens with the following lines, and these are quotations.
Mm-hmm.
Trans people need and deserve protection. I believe the majority of trans-identified people not only pose zero threat to others, but are vulnerable. I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. I feel nothing but empathy and solidarity with trans women who've been abused by men. These are all statements from J.K. Rowling.
Right.
And so, yes, even if you think that her position that biological sex is real and that trans people are not actually the sex that they identify as, if you think that she's mistaken about that, and that if you think that her holding this mistaken view has some kind of negative consequences, it's still not the same thing as bigotry. It's still not the same thing as prejudice on her part. It's at best when she says things like this, it's at best a mistake. And I mean, I don't think it's a mistake with regard to the question of biological sex. I think she's right about that. I think then the question of what the policy accommodations should be for people who identify that way, who are trans, that's the complicated issue. And I don't think we disagree about quite as much as you think that we do on the question of policy. I think that it's.
Yeah, I'm not saying I think we're I'm not quite sure. I don't think either of us has thought this all the way through. But okay. I don't want to say the fact that this article could start with a bunch of quotes like this proves that she's all right and not really hateful. You can find lots of people who speak out of both sides of their mouth.
Yeah.
And
but
some
I've been
of my
following
best
her for a
friends
long
about
time.
people.
And
But if you look at the kinds of things that are the allegedly worst things she said, there's just not a record of her being hateful. Yeah. There's the worst, maybe she's over concerned about a relatively rare phenomenon of women getting abused in all women's in what used to be single-sex spaces by people who are identifying as female, and but really are doing it for exploitive reasons. Maybe that's a bogeyman kind of problem and doesn't really happen. It doesn't really happen as much as she's worried about. You can come up with things. Maybe she's bought into some prejudice and she's harmfully spreading it. But those kinds of things, if that's true, are a normal part of what good people do, and they're mistakes, and they should be called out for them if you want to call out people. But what real calling out would be isn't shaming them for making the mistake, but if some influential person makes it, and it really is a mistake, using it as an opportunity to say, well, why this isn't true, what's a better way to look at it. But that has not been what's been happening with her. And that's why I'm less interested in talking about the issue of whether she's right or wrong about these things, what the actual facts are. What's been happening is she's been made into kind of an avatar for wickedness. One shouldn't support her because she's a transphobe. People should divest from her and so forth. And that kind of behavior, it's a kind of behavior that's appropriate for the very worst, most evil people. That to try to the kind of use of it here, even if she were wrong about all the things that people claim that she's wrong about, and even if there were harmful effects from it, I think the effect of making this issue one of demonizing and stigmatizing people, particularly people whose views are very moderate in the kind of sphere of the different views people could have, cannot accomplish anything other than to make people dig in and entrench into political tribal identities, cannot be doing anything except exacerbating dislike and resentment to trans people, for trans people among people who are potential allies, as I think Rowling herself clearly is and wants to be. And likewise for anybody else who the people doing this kind of demonizing imagine to be, really are or are imagined to be, in vulnerable positions.
I think there's also a point to make here that's parallel to points that we made about, strangely parallel to points we made about people like Jefferson and Sanger, where it's not simply that there's misrepresentation of her moral character going on here. It's further to the point that this is a person, J.K. Rowling, who's contributed a great amount of value to the world, and including value that has, I think, empowered a great many young people to think carefully about who they are and what their identity is and what they want it to be. And this was brought out by the article, which at one point quotes Ralph Fiennes, the actor who ironically plays Voldemort in the movies, and he says J.K. Rowling has written these great books about empowerment, about young children finding themselves as human beings. It's about how you become a better, stronger, more morally centered human being. He said the verbal abuse directed at her is disgusting. It's appalling. I agree with him completely. Yeah. And a lot of young adults today owe their kind of moral centeredness to the books that they read. And some of them even owe their careers. And here I'm thinking of Daniel Radcliffe, who was Harry Potter himself, who's now joined the crowd of trying to cancel J.K. Rowling, who would be nobody if it weren't for her. But the
Well,
material
I mean,
point is less
he might have
important
had some other good
than
one, but
the moral point.
yeah, there's something
It's ingratitude.
very
It's basic
unattractive and
injustice.
wrong and unjust about this kind of witch hunt mentality. We talked before about the importance of thinking about who you're going to sanction and who you're not going to sanction and who do you want to speak for and work with and so forth. But part of doing that justly is doing it in a way that's contextual. And this idea that you boycott anybody who's a little bit wrong by your lights on something is deeply mistaken, wrong, unjust, and not a way to advance any kind of case for justice. This is, even if she's wrong about all the things she's saying, even if some of that wrongness is coming from a prejudice, if it is, it's a kind of prejudice that's common as dirt. And the way to combat it isn't to demonize some of the most prominent moderate type people with it, as though they were the Klan or avatars of some, crazy backwards way of thinking, but to treat it as, sad and regrettable that they're mistaken about the things they are, and to find forums to explain not how horrible the person is, but why what they say is wrong. And the whole idea of boycott, divest, shame, etc., is really incompatible with that.
So let's pivot to another topic that has interesting overlaps, which is controversy about alleged insensitive remarks by another English author, although one who is now late, the late Roald Dahl. And many of the same people, I suspect, who are coming to Rowling's defense these days are nonetheless critical of a policy that has, I think, just been uncovered. The publishers of Roald Dahl's books have apparently been bowdlerizing his
You're
texts.
saying nonetheless they're critical, as though you'd expect them to be up. How do you see this as playing out?
Well, I think the people who typically defend Rowling under the guise of they're defenders of free thought, she should be able to speak her mind, are also now critical of the quote unquote what they call censorship of Dahl's books. I don't think
by his press,
by his publisher, but with the consent of his estate. So I don't think we should spend too much time on the subject. That I don't think this is censorship at all.
but let's
Censorship
say
is
just
when
what's actually happening. So
censorship is when the government is the one that's in charge of being the arbiter of ideas and deciding that some are not to be published, and that's clearly not what's happening here. It's not even the
let's
case.
just say what is happening if people don't know the case. So
Right,
Roald Dahl's
so-
an author of children's books, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda. What other ones?
Incredible Mr. Fox, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, Danny Champion of the World. I was a big fan of his when I was young.
Yeah, I wasn't as it happened. But anyway, he's a children's book writer, and he passed away within the last 20 years. And now it turns out that it's come to light that his press had some sensitivity readers, and they've been making changes to, they're planning on making changes to forthcoming editions of his books, changing various words to make them more, as they see it, sensitive, or they're stopping describing some characters as ugly, for example. People who were described as little men, the Oompa Loompas, are now being described as little people. There are some
Is
other...
that better?
I'm not sure. There are some other various changes being made. And there's a lot of outrage over this.
Yeah.
The best tweet I saw about this said that this is more like New Coke than like censorship, which I think is a good way of describing the situation. I don't know if people are familiar. At one point, Coca-Cola changed their recipe to New Coke, and no one liked it. And so now we have Coke Classic. There's some other details about what happened with that change. But
I think you could reason. I haven't looked at all of the changes, obviously. A few of the ones I saw seemed a little silly, oversensitive to in light of today's kind of woke sensitivities, but I don't think all of them were that way. And just in principle, like if especially if the estate decides, yeah, we think that there were insensitivities in the way he wrote things, and we'd like to represent his work, keep its legacy as intact as we can, while reaching the audiences with what we think is the main value of his work. I don't see the problem with that. Yeah. It's not like they're going out and burning all of the old ones so that nobody can go and find out what he actually wrote. In fact, it's only because they were able to find out what he actually wrote that they noticed the comparisons.
And there's something that strikes me as entitled about some of the response to this. I'm entitled to have this book the way I remember it from my childhood, and they're thinking of it as the right of the author to have his works maintained for posterity and so forth. But he seemingly was okay with this because now maybe he would have opposed it, I don't know, but he was apparently making changes to editions of his work throughout his life, and as they were republished, and consented to whatever arrangement by which his publishers would continue to do it after his death. So this kind of high horse of principle, oh my God, we're changing the great man's works, or we're changing history by erasing this, seems to me to be the wrong attitude. It's a product that's being offered, and we can think about each of the revisions that are being made as is it wise or not. And some of them seem to me to not be wise, and others may be wise. But I don't think, it also seems to be a lot of dropping of the context of how this thing is normally handled. So the play I know as And Then There Were None or 10 Little Indians originally had a different title. It was 10 Little Something Elses, and I'm not going to say the word, but
that was the original name of the children's nursery. And that was the original name of the children's
nursery. And I don't feel like that I only learned that a lot later in life. I was deprived of history for not knowing that the N-word was in the title of something. It's that word changed in meaning. People were realized that it was, offensive and hurtful even in the earlier incarnations, and they changed it. And I don't feel deprived from that.
So you probably think that Greedo shot first, huh?
I think this is exactly the issue. I think that I think this is exactly a Greedo shot first issue. And this is in Star Wars, when George Lucas edited the Star Wars movies in the 90s. In the original 70s version, Han Solo shoots this moneylender character who's after him before the moneylender character gets a shot off, and they revised it to make Han seem like less of a rogue, and they have the other guy shoot first. I think
just a fraction.
Yeah, I think it's a much better movie. The scene is much better with Han shooting first, and there are a lot of people who say Han shoots first, and I agree. I think it was a poor choice on Lucas's part to change it, but he changed all kinds of stuff that whatever. It's his movie. He's able to put it out in different forms, and it's an aesthetic question of good or bad judgment, not. Now, in this case, it was the very same person who originally wrote it who changed it, so there's not someone else changing his work. But it's authors contract for these kind of things, and if you're very careful about wanting your work to be published exactly as you wrote it and not have any kind of changes, as some authors are, and for good reason, then you get into a different kind of arrangement than if you're someone who is primarily a children's author, who probably wants your books to be enjoyed by generations of children who aren't going to be able to read it carefully and with context and so forth. And there are arguments for more updating for children's books and children's movies. And I'm not sure what I think of them, but it's an issue that it's up to the creator, it's up to the publishers for them to decide. Some of these changes seem ill-advised to me, others not. I think it's much more a new Coke or Han shot first kind of thing than it is an issue of anybody's freedom or artistic or intellectual integrity.
And here's another parallel. I don't know how far we want to go into this, but Ayn Rand wrote a novel, We the Living, which was set in Soviet Russia. It was her first novel, written in the 30s, and she herself, and subsequently when she became more popular in the 50s, right, is when it was re-edited. Revised it to take out passages that she thought had the wrong philosophic implications that made her sound a little too much like a Nietzschean when she was increasingly critical of Nietzsche.
I mean, she revised it in various ways. I think that's actually a pretty small part of the revisions that were made, but it is a part. There's a good essay by Robert Mayu in his collection, Essays on Ayn Rand's We the Living, about all the revisions that were made. Like, a lot of them were different in style than that. But yeah, so on the one hand, yeah, there's an author revising her work later. On the other hand, she would have gone apoplectic if she thought the publishers were going to change her books after her death. But
although she also gave her her estate the right to do with her materials as they saw fit, and
Right.
and they've released certain things for publication that are edited, and we could argue some of them better, some of them worse. I think we know which ones they are, and we won't go into that. But
I'm talking about the published books. I
yeah.
think there was going to be a sensitivity reader updated version of Atlas
oh,
Shrugged.
yeah, she would.
But
she would object to
I
that.
think, put her...
And so would the estate.
Right. Her works in the hands of people who would object to it. And I think, it's important for authors to think about this kind of thing with their works. And
When they're thinking about who their estate's going to be. And that's all the more reason why it's important who you associate with.
and what
make
kind of
alliances
contracts
with.
they have with their publishers and so forth.
And do you trust your publisher?
All right. What else do we have on our agenda? We're going to talk about the education wars. a
One
little
last topic, but I need to go in like 10 minutes, so we should not spend too much time on it. We don't need to because I did a whole podcast on it with Sam Weaver.
bit. Who's DeSantis in Florida and education?
DeSantis' push to ideologically transform Florida's higher education, which is the topic on Friday. And we were talking about basically his proposal to revise the curriculum of the new college of Florida, which is the honors college run by the state. Also, his support for the so-called Anti-Woke Act, which has implications for Florida's higher education. And Sam and I basically took a kind of mixed. We had a mixed evaluation of what DeSantis is doing. I think, on the whole, well, the first thing to say on the whole is that the current state of higher education in America is definitely an unjust left-wing monopoly on the major ideological institutions.
Well,
and
forget left-wing or right-wing. It's the effect of the DeSantis's of 40 years ago or 60 years ago, whenever they set it out. That is, forget what DeSantis's particular politics are. Some people set up and entrenched a certain kind of educational establishment that they then gave those people who they put in power at that time the ability to choose their descendants and heirs and so forth, in just the sort of way people are worried that DeSantis might be doing with the schools he's empowering. And why are yesterday's DeSantis better than today's DeSantis?
And so the reason that they'll try to give is that they think that today's professors have academic freedom, but and that's something we've talked about in a previous episode. But what's somewhat important here is the fact that if you're going to have a system of public education, which I oppose and we oppose, then it needs to be run in the way that a public institution is run, and the whole justification that this crowd gives for it is that is the democratic option. And so what happens when you have a leader who has who wins by very large margins, very popular with the voters, who also seem to support him in this move, want to change the ideological character of the institution. And in DeSantis' defense, he's not even claiming that he wants to make it a Hillsdale College of the right, though some people think that that's what he would do, and some people think one of his people on the board of trustees is more likely to do that. But he's just saying we need to remove this monopoly. We need to introduce ideological balance. And this is what Ayn Rand argued for in her article "Fairness Doctrine in Education." And she argued there shouldn't be public education. That but if there's going to be, it can't. It's unjust to force some people to support financially education that doesn't represent their view. And that the only way that you can start to transition out of this, it's never going to actually be fair, contrary to the name of the Fairness Doctrine, is at least try to say every significant viewpoint in the society needs to be in some way represented. And you can take issue, I think, with some of the ways that DeSantis is going about doing this. Like Rand herself says, it shouldn't be through the executive branch. It should be through the courts. Citizens should sue to gain some kind of representation for their views. But, I mean, in principle, it's hard to take issue with what he's doing unless you misrepresent what's actually being done.
But even if you take a pretty bad reading of what he's doing, like even if you think he's trying to create, something that highly politicized and you don't like it and you're opposed to it, and the current educational establishment was created in just this way.
Yeah.
If you just abstract away from the particular positions that people hold, right? He's saying, well, I'm looking for moderation and the counterbalance and whatever, and his critics are saying, no, you're appointing radicals with wrong views or whatever. But that's always what's going to happen when you have people disagreeing. What's the essence of what's going on here is that Florida politicians are changing the setup of Florida public schools in some way. But the status quo of the setup in Florida public schools is the result of the previous generations of meddling of Florida politicians. And even when there's no new meddling, the system is just playing itself out. It's playing itself out by a logic set up by yesterday's politicians who appointed yesterday's heads of the school, who froze in place the people with tenure at the time that they did, that then become the selection criteria. If you have public education, it's political. And
if you don't like that, you shouldn't have public education.
If you don't like that, you shouldn't have public education. And I think ultimately the solution is that you shouldn't have public education. I say that from a public institution, but they should be privatized. But insofar as they're not privatized, I don't think it's ridiculous to object that it's being politicized. If what you mean by politicized is that politicians with voter bases and demographics are behind them are influencing what's being taught. How else could it be? It couldn't be any other way. It's the whole institution is a political creature. If what you're saying is that they're injecting political views that are weird, outside the mainstream, the wrong political views to be injecting yourself, okay, then you could have that discussion on the merits. But I think it's a pretty strong case that
there are no such merits at this point. Like,
and if you look
changes haven't even happened yet.
But you can look at the kind of wider complexion of things that have happened in Florida. So there was an AP Black history or African American history, I forget what it was called, the test that DeSantis had some objections to, and Dick.
Well, that's the other thing I want to talk about.
And I think McWhorter had a really good article on that, the versions of that test, and I think he's probably right about it.
Well, but let's talk about the other wrinkle on this, where we were more critical of DeSantis, because it's not all his, but he signed and sponsored in legislation this anti-woke act. Mm-hmm. And here is where I draw the line, and one of the things that would give someone pause about whether or not he has the best of intentions about this other thing. And what the anti-woke act did was prohibit professors from advocating, supporting, endorsing, offering any kind of positive appraisal of various types of critical race theory in the classroom. And look, the fact is that professors have views, and part of education usually involves proposing one's views and having discussions about them with students. And if you just say you're not allowed to advocate this view, and then the act also says all kinds of other things you are allowed to advocate that are more patriotic, I mean, that's government getting directly into the business of choosing winners and choosing sides on ideology. And if you look at that same Fairness Doctrine in Education article, Ayn Rand herself says that if you're going to have a doctrine like this, where you have to try to represent every significant viewpoint, then it would also be unfair if communists were excluded from the academy, because look, there's also communist taxpayers who have a view, who get to claim some kind of representation. And I think it would apply in spades, or at least in parity, to someone trying to ban critical race theory from
I don't like the idea that this is the government getting into arbitrating ideas in the classroom, because I think it got into that when it did public education.
Well, it's intensifying.
But I do think it is an intensification.
Yeah.
But I think we should be clear, there is no way to be ideologically neutral in our public education. It's a fantasy, but there are more and less egregious cases of it, and I think those kind of laws to stop woke and so forth do make it worse. And I think they're just. I have a second pair of objections to them. One is I think they're going to be ineffectual. They're not actually going to be able to stop teachers from teaching the things they don't want them to teach. They'll just find a new way of putting it, and I don't think it'll really prevent any of it. But second, every moment spent endorsing this kind of thing, fighting for this kind of every bit of political capital, is political capital taken away from the only thing that could actually help here, which is school choice. And anyone who's spending a second trying to get woke stuff taken out of school curricula should move that second over to freeing parents and older children who are able to make their own decisions to make their own decisions about their education. And this is more on the primary through high school level than the college level. But that happily there's some states moving more in the direction of school choice. There's a bill being considered in Florida. I don't think we know where DeSantis is going to fall on it yet. But that's where the fight is here. And I think this kind of other line is a distraction from it and taking away from it.
And incidentally, another reason why it's going to be ineffective is that it probably won't pass muster in the courts. And the federal district court already struck down the provisions of this act that banned instruction in CRT.
Yeah. I had one other little topic under this education heading, which is a video that's gone viral lately about a teacher who has a kind of MA in education or some kind of advanced degree in education, saying she's an expert and what parents don't know and why should she have to defer to parents, and then people criticizing this kind of criticizing her, or education degrees aren't even real degrees and she's a witch doctor, or in the case, not a legitimate scientist. What struck me about that video was the kind of desperation and in the woman's voice. And I was very unsympathetic to her position, but it struck me as very similar to the desperation I heard in the voice of a parent at a Board of Education meeting that I commented on an earlier podcast, who was complaining about some book in her child student library that had some sexual content she thought was perverse and didn't belong there. This kind of sense of hopelessness and anger and helplessness and etc. that was going on. And this is what happens when you rope everybody together and make them make collectively decisions about education. It's wrong to make people have their kids educated in ways that they despise and find contemptible. But it's also wrong to make the educators pander to the dictates of politically empowered groups, voters, who, say, here's how things should be taught, and so forth. The right way for people with, if the experts think they know better, the right way for experts to deal with people who are not experts, the right way for people with skills at things or who think they have skills at things to deal with the rest of us is voluntarily through trade. Sell me on it. Convince me that your way of teaching reading or history or whatever is better for my kid than the alternatives. I don't claim to know everything about how to educate him. I'm looking for people who have good ideas and who can, tell things. I read stuff on this. I think most parents do or would if they were free to do it. That is free to make these choices. And when you're in a situation where things are done coercively, by force, where we're all put together, our children in a common basket to be educated, and the determinations about how they're to be educated being made through a political process, you breed a lot of resentment, and justified resentment. But the place to focus that resentment isn't at the people who want the teaching to go differently than you think it should go. It's at a system and the people supporting the system that puts us in the situation of having to make these decisions together and not being able to work out what we think is right and to follow it.
Well, are we good to? I don't have anything to add to that. I think it except that I think maybe it brings out how the problems you see with the legislation in Florida, and the controversy about the legislation in Florida point to the fact that everybody's rights are being compromised when you have public education. That is not just the taxpayer's right; it's the right of intellectuals and professors and educators too, who have a view about what's the best way to educate and who are being paid to educate. Yes, by the taxpayers, but that they're inevitably put in conflict with each other, and it's hard to take sides with one or the other. And that's exactly the outcome that you would expect in a situation where people are operating under
put
force.
In a circumstance where in effect, the industry has been nationalized.
Yeah.
So that it, or statized or whatever, it's at the state level, so that there aren't the kind of opportunities to vend your wares in a private market education that there would otherwise be.
That's
Some
important.
people do it and it's hard, but it's these kinds of collectivizations of decisions about how to live our lives, including educate our children, are wrong. And it's because they're wrong that they breed this kind of resentment. That's how I think of it. Anyway.
I do have to say, with regard to the video that started the conversation, I am highly skeptical of people who assert their master's degree credentials as any kind of expertise in the realm of education, at least.
I'm also
where
very dubious
It's
about
a super
what passes
backwards field.
as expertise in education.
Yeah.
But there is or could be such a thing as
There
legitimate
could be.
expertise.
There could be.
And
But
part of the question
it's
always is, it's hard to
not really
judge.
been developed yet.
It's
by
hard
anybody.
to judge whether there's real expertise or not in a field. There are people who spend their lives, researching or learning something, and it's all BS. Acupuncture. Well, I don't know if acupuncture, but like herbal medicines or Reiki or whatever. And you spend a lot of time learning it, and there's nothing there to know, or at least so I'm claiming. But if you think there is something there, that's the issue. Sometimes it's hard to tell, and you can't force us all into the situation of having to make the decision together collectively. And if you really do have knowledge about something, expertise, you should be able to make it objective to people who can be your customers, not to the people who get to be your customer based on whichever demographic can sway the election most this time. Whatever.
Okay.
All right. With that, we sign off.
Thank you all.
Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.
You stole that.
That's Chevy Chase, or who was it?